how to teach handwriting. That's the next section. And handwriting is a really important skill, so we're going to spend some time talking about this because many people ask this question, do we still even need to teach handwriting? And in fact, many schools are no longer doing instruction in handwriting at all because they say that, hey, why would we need to learn to write handwriting if we're going to use keyboards? But there's some things that we need to know and understand about handwriting that are very, very important. One study at the University of Marseille taught adults a new alphabet. And they taught some of the adults only how to type the alphabet, and they taught another group of adults how to write the alphabet. And they were teaching them the sounds and the letters, and then they tested them. And they said, how do these groups compare, the groups that learned to write it and the groups that learned to type it? And they did functional MRI studies, which tracked oxygenation and blood flow in the brain as they were reading the alphabet. And the interesting thing is that the adults who learned to write it actually knew the sounds better, and they could read better, and they were activating the motor sensory areas of their brain while they were reading. And that was not happening in the group that learned to type it. And so one of the conclusions was, when writing by hand, the movements involved leave a motor memory in the sensory motor part of the brain, which helps us to recognize letters. Now, this is just one study. There are many now pointing to the importance of handwriting, not only as a skill in of itself, but for reading. And it's very interesting because our brains learn patterns. And if you stop and think what it means for a very young child to learn that these are all ducks, it's really remarkable, isn't it? They'll go, that's a duck, and that's a duck, and that's a duck. And then they identify this rubber yellow toy in the bathtub as a duck. It'd be hard to explain what makes those all ducks, right? But the brain is really, really good at finding and identifying patterns, and very complicated patterns. And one of the thoughts is that when we write by hand, we are activating, and we're going to go into detail in this, the letterbox region in our brain, which is essential to reading, and we're starting to learn the patterns. Because actually learning to read involves some very complicated patterns, doesn't it? You need to recognize that those are different, and these are the same. And they are starting to identify that it is through handwriting that children begin to go, this is what's important to making this a letter and that a different letter. And this is what's not important in these very complex patterns. So that is one of the theories, is that writing by hand helps us to discriminate what is a letter and which parts of that letter are important for making it the same. Handwriting is the kinesthetic experience of written language. It's also really important because this is how we experience language. And I want to give you a sample of this by teaching you a new language. So I am going to teach you a little bit of Russian. Does anyone in this room speak Russian? Good, then I don't have to apologize for how bad my Russian is. All right, so this is the phonogram ch. All right, go ahead and say ch with me. Ch. All right, and now we are going to learn how to write ch. And if you have a whiteboard, you can take it out. If you don't have a whiteboard, you can use a piece of paper and just draw some big lines on it. But I would like you to begin by taking your pointer finger, and I'd like you to put it on the midline. So go ahead and write a baseline, a midline, and a top line, and write them kind of big so you can use your pointer finger. All right, so put your pointer finger on the midline. You're going to swing up to the top line, down to the midline, swing up to the top line, down to the baseline. And this says ch. All right? It goes like this. Swing, down, ch. Go ahead and say it with me. Swing, down, ch. We could do that really big, too. Swing, down, ch. All right? It looks like this, and you could try writing it too. Swing down, ch. And I'm showing you how it looks in cursive because in Russian they learn to write in cursive. All right, the next phonogram is aw. Go ahead. Aw. And this looks very much like our aw, doesn't it? Or one of our phonograms. And the way that they write this is put your finger on the baseline, curve up to the midline, roll around to the baseline, swing up to the midline, down. And I'm collapsing this instruction, and we'll break it down a little bit more when we're learning to write the letters in English, but for the sake of time, it'll be curve, roll, swing, down. And do that with me. Curve, roll, swing, down, aw. Let's do it together. Curve, roll, swing, down, aw. How about ch? Swing, down, ch. By the way, you could do ch with your foot. Why don't you try it? Swing, down, ch. All right? Now, this letter is very hard to say. So listen very carefully, all right? It says this, E. All right, and you're like, what? Okay, do you remember when I said babies can distinguish or babble all these different sounds? Well, they can also distinguish all the sounds in all the languages. And there are different sounds of E in Russian. So let's say E like this, and put your fingers on your lips, E. And now relax your lips and say E. Okay, if I were to take that off, that's this, E. And it's called hard E. But when I put that little symbol over it, it's now soft E, E. Say those E, E. Can you even hear the difference? You can't. Many of you cannot, because these are not different phonemes in English, but they are different phonemes in Russian. And so babies can distinguish these sounds, which is very interesting. And at the age of 1, they lose this ability. Thus, that's where you're at. But can you feel the difference? E, E. And if you practice this enough and you were learning Russian, eventually you'd also be able to hear it. By the way, this is exactly what we do with students who are missing speech sounds. We teach them where they're pronounced and how, and then they can feel it, like stick your tongue between your teeth and blow, and pretty soon they're able to bring that into their speech. But what does this say again? E, all right? And here's how we write it. You'll put your finger on the baseline, swing up to the midline, down to the baseline, up to the midline, down to the baseline, and then curve. Ready? And what does it say? E. So swing down, E. Got it? Yep, and I can show you what it looks like. I'm going to do aw. All right, and this is what the cursive version looks like. It's a little bit different, but do you see the relationship too? Just like there are some differences in relationships in our language. Now, I've written a word. What does this say? I hear you saying it, and do any of you recognize this word? Chai? Yes, chai tea. And literally in Russian, chai means tea. Now, it does not mean tea with milk and sugar and spices like we often get at coffee shops here. It just means black tea. But what did you just do in Russian? You learned phonograms, you blended them together, and you read a word, and was it a word some of you recognized? Chai, yes. So maybe not the word you commonly knew or weren't expecting that, but but this is the process of learning the sounds, blending them together into words. Another thing with handwriting that's really important is that many students who are older, who have not been taught handwriting systematically, write like this, and then they really struggle with feeling a lot of shame. They don't feel good about themselves. So handwriting is really important, and it helps us to put words on paper. It helps us to learn to read. This is a little bit of a video clip from a school in South Carolina that's a high poverty school. 98% of their kids are in free and reduced lunch. And they adopted cursive and systematic handwriting practices. And this was in January of that first year, just samples of the handwriting. And it was really, really amazing how this, just to see this happening in the school. And one of the things the parents were all saying was they were coming back and going, my kid can write so well. And the parents felt really, really good about that. And it was also really interesting to me, so this is an administrator tip, or for any of you who are in leadership, some of the classrooms were teaching handwriting and some were not. And there was this big discrepancy developing across the classrooms. And so what the principal did is she started hanging up all the beautiful handwriting of classrooms out in the hallway. And pretty soon, other classrooms began teaching systematically. And so they had a lot of really great feedback about systematic handwriting instruction. Now, before you can begin to teach handwriting, you have to choose a handwriting style. And we could teach cursive or manuscript. First, I'd like to address why we could teach cursive, or why teach cursive first. So in cursive, you cannot reverse B's and D's and P's and Q's. So cursive prevents reversals, and that's a very powerful tool for kids who struggle with dyslexia or dysgraphia. Also, many students in manuscripts struggle with spacing. They put too much space between letters, too little space between words. But because the words are connected in cursive, you pick up your pencil between words. There's this kind of kinesthetic experience. A word is connected, pick up my pencil, and it solves all of the spacing issues. Also, if you use a program like Rhythm of Handwriting, which was developed by Logic of English, all of the lowercase letters begin in one place, which is on the baseline. So they all start on the baseline, whereas if you're teaching in manuscript, you always have to instruct where to start each letter. Start at the midline, start at the top line, start halfway between the midline and the baseline. But you must begin instruction with where to start with your pencil. And that's okay, I'm just comparing them. It's also surprising to many educators, but cursive was taught first in the United States until the 1940s. So my grandparents didn't learn manuscript in school, they learned cursive. And my grandfather, who had like a 7th grade education, had beautiful cursive. So did my grandmother. Now, they didn't have even a high school education, but they wrote in beautiful cursive. So that's a switch that happened that we don't often think about. We usually think, oh, wow, manuscript is just what everyone teaches first. Also, in many, many foreign languages, cursive is taught first, and that is true around the world. This is even a French children's book that was published in cursive to reinforce reading in cursive. That does not mean that we need children's books published in cursive in English. It's just to point out that most of the world actually starts with cursive. The English-speaking world is unusual in that. So cursive was designed for the human hand. If you write the word teacher right now in your notebook, in both cursive and manuscript, pause as you write them, think about how many fine motor skills you're using with each one. Think about which one's more difficult fine motor-wise. What do you notice? Cursive is smoother. With manuscript, you're picking up your pencil a lot, so it requires more fine motor movement. Cursive was the form of writing designed for the human hand. Manuscript or printing was actually designed for the printing press. It was designed for these movable type letters. Now, how many of you write in beautiful, perfect cursive all the time? Raise your hands. Maybe one of you. How many of you write consistently always in manuscript, and it's just always manuscript? One or two of you? How many of you mix? Okay, this is true, again, across the United States. And the reason is this. We started learning manuscript in kindergarten, and most of us learned cursive in 3rd or 4th grade. But when you develop that muscle memory, it is very difficult to switch. So if any of you are musicians you know that if you learn it wrong, it's very difficult to go back and unlearn that muscle memory. Well, we have 3 or 4 years of practice in printing, and though most adults would like to write in beautiful cursive, we struggle to overcome all that muscle memory. Now, I want to be careful. There are reasons to teach cursive, like we've talked about, lack of issues with reversals, the letters are connected, they all start on the baseline. But the most important thing is that you teach handwriting systematically. So you can teach manuscript just fine. The real important thing is that you teach systematically. And there are reasons to teach manuscript. One, very valid one, is your state or your school district requires it. There are states that standards will not allow you to begin with cursive. It's totally fine. You will not damage your children. So go ahead and stick with manuscript, but be sure to have systematic instruction. It's also very valid when there's so many changes happening to curriculum and learning new methods for teaching reading. Some teachers are overwhelmed by the thought of changing handwriting styles. Totally fine to stay with manuscript, but it is very important to teach it systematically. So one of the questions we get too is, well, with cursive, don't the letters look different? But I want to point out, the letters look different whether you're teaching manuscript or cursive, don't they? It's just we often don't think that A, A, has all of these different fonts. Cursive just adds connectors. And regardless of what form of handwriting you're teaching, it's very important to expose children to various forms of those letters. And in fact, it's much like those ducks. As they learn that that's a duck, and that's a duck, and that's a duck, they learn this is an A-A-A, and that's an A-A-A, and that's an A-A-A. And our brains actually like that and are very good at learning those patterns. Here's just another example, right? G, J. There's many different font forms. Cursive adds connectors, but we still need to be teaching the relationship. So whatever format of handwriting you're teaching, you should be having some matching activities between handwriting and book face, and between handwriting and various book face fonts. The same is true with cursive, as well as with manuscript. Here's a little sample of a game in a kindergarten classroom of matching cursive to manuscript.
Where they're written a little differently. Everyone's going to get a card and you have to find your partner that matches you. So come up here and get a card and then find your partner. Go around and look for the person that has the same one as you do. Once you get your partner, sit down beside him, please. Turn and talk to your partner and say the sound that you have. D.
So let's look a little bit closer at how to teach handwriting. If you're teaching essentials, you'd be using rhythm of handwriting. And if you're teaching foundations, handwriting is embedded in this program. So in foundations A and B, you have your handwriting already embedded. And all you really need to teach handwriting is one of these charts. All the directions are here, and these handwriting charts can be very, very useful. All right, well, let's go and look a little deeper at how to teach handwriting. So the goal of teaching handwriting is to develop rhythmic, automatic muscle memory. So what I want to pull out of this is that people who have good handwriting write with a rhythm. Kids who struggle or adults who struggle with handwriting start, and then they stop, and then they have to think about it, and they don't have a rhythm to their handwriting. Good handwriting is also automatic. So you've developed the muscle memory. You don't have to think about it. If you have to stop and go, how do I form an E every single time, that's going to interrupt your flow when you're trying to write something. It's going to get into the way of the higher order thinking. So we need to develop rhythmic and automatic muscle memory. So the first step is to teach the strokes using large motor movements. This is true regardless of the age. So large motor movements are much more easy to understand and to see. Fine motor is a little bit more abstract. So we are going to learn a few of the phonograms and just step through the steps of how to teach it. So we're going to teach a stroke, and this stroke is swing. And the swing stroke starts at the baseline and swings up to the midline. Let's do it. Swing. Ready? Swing. Okay? The next stroke is down. You'll start at the midline and go down to the baseline. Ready? Down. And I'm giving an example in cursive. Same thing applies in manuscript. The next stroke is dot. Halfway between the midline and the top line, dot. All right? Once you've taught the strokes, the next step is to teach the single letter, lowercase letter phonograms grouped by initial stroke. And I need to clarify here, you do not need to teach all the strokes, just the strokes you need for the first phonogram. Each of these handwriting charts have groups of letters. So all of these in this section begin with the swing stroke. You can teach them in any order. You'll find in foundations they actually start with all the curve letters. You can start wherever you want, but usually we teach letters right, as in A and then B and then C, and there's no relationship between the muscle memory in those letters. So instead, we group them by stroke, and that gives us that practice with the muscle memory. So we're going to look at the ones with the swing strokes. And when you teach a phonogram, start by showing the book face version and saying the sound. So this says I, E, ya. And then we will compare it to the handwritten version. What do you notice about the cursive version and the book face version? What's the same? They both have a dot. They both kind of have a line. What's different with the cursive version? Yeah, there's these connectors, and that helps our hand to write them better.
And it also starts at the baseline, the other one starts more midline.
Well, but a child maybe doesn't know which direction they start, right, visually, but you're right, one starts at the baseline and one would start at the midline to form it. Then we will demonstrate how to write the phonogram step by step using large motor movements and explicit instructions. So you'll start at the baseline, swing up to the midline, down to the baseline, dot, I, E, ya. And once they have that down and they can say those instructions to you, then they can move to the student doing it with large motor motions and just saying those. Swing, down, dot. Swing, down, dot. I, E, ya. Let's do it together. Swing, down, dot. I, E, ya. And those rhythmic directions are found on the back of the phonogram tactile cards. They're also found in bold on your reference chart. They're also found in bold in your teacher's manual. But they're a simple way to shorten those instructions and get at that rhythm for handwriting. Once the students can do that, you can have them practice this large motor with a whiteboard or other large motor by saying swing, down, dot, I, E, ya. And it's a really good idea to practice, especially with young children, large motor for a little bit first. And large motor can have all sorts of ways that that's done. There's ideas in your book as well. Let's do another letter. So this says a, u, u, and here's how it looks when it's written. What's the same? And what's different? The connectors, yep. We would write it like this. Start at the baseline, swing, up to the midline, down to the baseline, up to the midline, down to the baseline. And that becomes swing, down, a, u, u, Let's do it together. Swing, down, a, u, u, And it's really interesting when kids forget how to write a letter when they're new. When you start out going swing down, they'll go, oh yeah, swing down, a, u, u, And that becomes part of how they remember. Here's a video of a classroom teaching and an example.
We're going to learn how to make a cursive We're going to make this phonogram in cursive. Now, let me give you some directions. Listen very closely. you would actually start halfway between the midline and top line. You're going to curve to the top line, straight down to the baseline. You're going to bump to the top line, straight down to the baseline, bump up to the top line again. Then you're going to go down. Okay, I'm going to show you on the board, and then I'm going to give you a chance to practice in the air. You would start halfway between the midline and the top line. You're going to bump up to the top line, straight down to the baseline, bump up to the top line, straight down to the baseline again. Then you're going to bump up to the top line again and down. Now we're going to try it again, but this time I want you to try it with me with your fingers in the air. Are you ready? All right, fingers in the air. Start halfway between the midline and the top line. Curve up to the top line. Straight down to the baseline. Very good. Bump up to the top line. Very good. Straight down to the baseline. Bump up to the top line again. And down. Awesome job.
Now, it feels like it takes a lot of time to teach how to write a phonogram. However, if you ask around in most schools, they keep reteaching handwriting every single year. And one of the things I like to do when I'm training a full school is to have the second, third, fourth grade teachers talk to the kindergarten and first grade teachers about what they're seeing in handwriting. And what we almost always see happen is these schools get really excited to go, wait a minute, if we did this in kindergarten and first grade systematically, we wouldn't have to keep reteaching it. And so if they got to me knowing this, then, so a little bit of investment up front has a really big payoff later on. Here are these students now back at their desks practicing.
We're just going to say curve, straight, bump, straight, bump, down. Again, we're going to say curve, straight, bump, straight, bump, down.
So just a little peek at how this school was implementing it. So once you teach students how to write the phonograms, you need to also then teach them either how to connect the letters to form words if they're learning cursive, or how to space the letters to form words. And remember, spacing letters in manuscript is really tricky, so it needs to take some time. In cursive, it's pretty easy because if it starts at the baseline, then the next letter just starts again at the baseline. And there are a few letters that end at the midline, and then you have to just teach them that it goes straight into the next letter from that midline. And I sometimes tell them an analogy. The O is like holding out its hand, and it's holding on to the T's foot. And kids just very quickly get this and are able to connect those letters that end with a dip stroke at the midline. Now, with manuscript, you have a different problem, because if you think about this, this is actually a very complicated visual spatial challenge, because k, right, starts and then it curves back around. At A curves back around. Well, then many kids will put way too much space before the t, because they don't realize that it's not going to curve. And then they're like, oh, now there's too much space, and then they start that one closer, and then sat ends up too close, right? Because that one curves around again. So it takes a lot of practice when you're learning manuscript to get this spacing correct. So you need to spend time on that. Once the kids have large motor, you can switch to fine motor. Now with older students, you can switch the same day. You could teach these strokes, write it once or twice, and then switch right to fine motor. With younger students, you might want to keep them writing large motor for all of kindergarten, except those who have good fine motor. That's fine too. So you can tailor this to the age and needs of the student. When you go to teach fine motor, though, you're going to need to teach how to hold a pencil. And I know some people get very particular, is it a 2-finger grip or a 3-finger grip? And I personally don't have strong feelings about this as long as you're using fine motor. If the student's doing this or this, they're not using fine motor. So then you need to help them to develop a grip that helps them do fine motor. And one way to do that is to use pencil grips. And you can get a variety of pencil grips, and those variety of grips teach different grips. And this is a place a student could choose. Which one do you like best? You can try them. Oh, you like this one best? Great, that's the one you'll use. So you can help them with that. If they don't have good fine motor skills, I would strongly encourage that they work on fine motor skills separately from handwriting through using building blocks or stringing beads or stringing noodles or working with screws and nuts, but working with these fine motor skills. And I've been told by a number of occupational therapists that we're in a new generation because kids are growing up with tablets and phones, and these phones and tablets and all that experience as toddlers and preschoolers, they're coming to kindergarten with fewer fine motor skills than previous generations. So that's something to be aware of. But just because the students don't have good fine motor skills doesn't mean you skip handwriting. You do all that handwriting large motor then, and you have stations in the room where they can work on fine motor development, and when they have this, it will translate. It's also important to teach the students how to tilt the paper. So many people look at the logic of English or the rhythm of handwriting letters and go, they're slanted. That's really fancy. Shouldn't we write block letters? But here's the thing. All right, if you were to take a piece of paper and you were to put it straight on and then try to open your elbow, because your elbow opens and closes for reading and writing, what happens is you do this and you get a line like this. But if you tilt your paper and then you open your elbow, you get a line that follows the lines. Well, when you're writing with your paper tilted, guess what happens? It tilts the letters when you straighten it out. Does that make sense? But tilting your paper is about your elbow not getting crunched in, because this way your elbow opens as you're writing, and this way it's like, and then you see kids trying to maneuver it in all sorts of ways. So that's just good ergonomics to teach the kids how to tilt the paper when they're writing. Once you've taught one form of handwriting, most people opt to teach the other form of handwriting. And if you use a systematic handwriting program, this is pretty simple. If you switch programs or mix it all up and teach it in different ways in different years, it's harder. But cursive and manuscript have a lot of relationships, don't they? If you started with cursive, curve, roll, swing down, it becomes, oh, we're skipping that curve stroke, we're picking up our pencil, and now it becomes roll, swing, straight. So we can show those relationships. Or if you started with manuscript, it can be, oh, now we're adding in connectors. And with rhythm of handwriting, the language is paired between cursive and manuscript as closely as it can be, given the differences in the letters, to keep the similarities the same. It's also important that we do not trace. Tracing is a very common way to teach handwriting. I see some of you going, really? But here's the situation with tracing. These are like dot to dots. And so when kids do this, they do this. Are they developing rhythmic handwriting? Nope, they need to learn curve, roll, swing, down, and that rhythm. So tracing is actually not helpful. And actually, we're going to learn a little bit more about that in relationship to reading as well. It's also important to use a variety of mediums. And these are some ideas for you: finger paint, shaving cream, sidewalk chalk. Kids become really engaged when they're writing in different ways. This is really important in elementary school especially, and it's very much possible in the classroom. So here's an example of a classroom practicing handwriting.
First phonogram, I'm actually going to give you two right now. The two phonograms in our English language that make the sound. One's at the beginning, and the other one is at the beginning or the end of English words. end of the word September, the word December.
So they're practicing their phonograms, they're practicing handwriting, but just by mixing up what they're writing with and in, it creates this whole new level of engagement for them and experience for them. All right. It's also important to not provide copy work to students where they're copying sentences if they cannot read that. So if they can read it, fine, and if you've taught them how to write each of those letters. Otherwise, it's artwork. They're copying it, but it doesn't have any meaning, and it's not making the connections to language. When you look at Rhythm of Handwriting or Foundations, you're going to find that our handwriting pages have a variety of line sizes, and this often surprises people. But the reason that there's very tiny lines is young children have very small hands, and many young children, when they're writing, want to write very tiny. Other children actually are not able to write tiny, and they want to write much bigger. And so what we tell them is, you choose which size makes sense for you. So we let them experiment, and then we let them select which line size they want. And we do this, right? Some of you like college rule, some of you like wide rule. So there's a little bit more variation here, but I think one of the other takeaways is this. Just because a child is in kindergarten doesn't mean they need a line size like this. For many kids, that's very difficult because their hands are small. When you're teaching 3 to 5-year-olds, this is for the preschool teachers in here, you can teach 1 phonogram per day or 1 every 2 days. And when you teach it, teach how to read it and how to write it. And then keep practicing them as you go with games. There's a lot of phonogram games and handwriting games. It's also really important that that practice for 3 to 5-year-olds feel like play. So kids can learn through play. They can write in sensory boxes. They can write with Play-Doh. They can write with salt boxes or with shaving cream. I mean, all sorts of things where they're experiencing it as play. In this preschool group, too, it's important to emphasize large motor instruction. If they have fine motor skills, if they're picking up pencils, great, go for it. If they're not, keep going with large motor instruction. For students who are older than 6, then it's a good idea to learn or review the A through Z phonograms with 1 stroke per day or a couple of them, 2 or 3 of them grouped together. So you might group all 2 or 3 of the swing strokes together. And with older kids, sometimes you can teach the entire section by stroke, and within a few days, they will know all the lowercase letters. Christy is nodding her head back there because she taught kids in summer reading camps cursive in a week. And they loved it, and they were able to grasp it, and they went from struggling writers, which that photo early on was one of her students, to writing beautiful cursive. So you can group them together, but if you group them by stroke, they're practicing that initial stroke over and over. So 1 stroke a day is one option. And with these students, it's also important to begin large motor. And once they can demonstrate it large motor, then you can move to fine motor, even in the same lesson. All right, any thoughts or questions about handwriting?
After, I think we're in our 2nd year of LOE right now, and so handwriting has come back, and so has cursive in our region, in the majority of our schools, and we're hearing from the parents, they're thrilled. They are so happy that it's back out in the community again, and the kids are so excited, so we've seen it shift the other way finally.
Good, good. And it's really important because truly, children don't feel good about themselves when they don't write well. It's a reflection of, writing is a very personal reflection of who we are too, so mastering this skill is important. And again, we will go more deeply into this, but it is deeply connected to learning to read. And we now know that. There's no question that handwriting and reading go hand in hand.